So we're in Leviticus, excitement and joy, right? The answer is absolutely. As many of you know, I recently became a father, 2 months ago Wednesday, so he's attending my first sermon, so don't heckle me too much, okay? And believe it or not, Leviticus has taken on a very new kind of voice to me in the midst of my fatherly duties. Oh, sorry, children. I forgot to dismiss the children. Follow Kyle and enjoy your time, because you don't want to hear this sermon. So while I've poured myself into studying Leviticus and its rituals, you guys all know that I have a certain love for this book. There is a particular way that has helped me reflect on my fatherhood. Maybe you know where I'm going with this, but indulge me. Here is the law of the cleanness of my baby. I am his father, and Darren is his mother. Whatever we say shall be obeyed, because we brought him home from the hospital. We are his parents. If you approach a bathroom and use it, eat food without utensils, or touch your hands to any surface that is suspect, you shall wash your hands with warm water, making sure to scrub under your fingernails, and after drying your hands thoroughly, apply the hand sanitizer that is on the counter, which is by the sink. By doing this, you shall avoid making my baby unclean, and you shall thereby also be protected from the wrath of his parents. You shall teach these things diligently to your children, that it may go well with you in the church. You shall be careful to do all of these things. We are his parents who brought him home from the hospital. In other words, this life event prompted me to reflect on rituals, and trust me, we have a lot of rituals now with this newborn baby. But more generally, it got me thinking about procedures, because really, rituals are just procedures that are done in the context of worship. They're sacred procedures. And where do procedures come from? Procedures emerge when a group of people decide that a practice is important and common enough to necessitate formal instruction so that everyone is on the same page. But it doesn't take long before procedures become wooden shadows of the vibrant conversation and community that developed them. And as more and more generations pass, the intentions behind these procedures will invariably rot and decay without constant refurbishing and updating. And here's why. Procedures can collect and focus the intentions of a group, but they cannot transmit those intentions. The intention must be rediscovered with each subsequent generation. But it gets even more tricky. Not only can procedures lose intention, as I've said over and over again, I'm sure you're sick of me saying it, they can actually be used to accomplish the opposite intention of the original community that produced them. So here is where we have to go this morning, like it or not. We are first going to examine what the words clean and unclean really mean. If you've been in small groups studying Leviticus, you probably have an idea where I'm going with this. Then we're going to look at the sacred procedures in Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. And then we'll walk through the kind of communities that these rituals were attempting to make. Namely, we're going to try to discern the intention behind these rituals. And after that, we'll take a look at the prophetic witness of Jesus and explore how he reveals the intention of these sacred procedures. And then we'll look at what that means as far as building a holy community in our midst. My hope is that you'll gain an appreciation for the intention of God and these Israelites that are characters in this text, but also learn from the inevitable failure if we simply count on rituals and procedures to produce faithfulness to or love for God. So, let's take a look at clean and unclean. I have given you a little colorful diagram that may look familiar to you if you've done the curriculum. It is very nice, isn't it, Dan? So let's take a look at clean and unclean and what they mean specifically in the book of Leviticus, because whether we like it or not, these words color the way we understand this text. So since unclean, I think, probably has the biggest stigma associated with it, that's where I'm going to start. So unclean has several connotations, I think, for us. Perhaps we think disgusting, gross, even immoral. Think back to my instructions, right? You wash your hands because germs are gross, right? And I don't want your germs on my baby, right? So I'm using the term that way there. If these are our go-to ideas, which they generally are, then we're likely to come to some strange conclusions when we read Leviticus 11 through 15. You might be led to assume that God thinks certain animals are gross, that women who have given birth are disgusting, and people with skin diseases are immoral, which is in fact not the case. All of the derivatives of this word, unclean, happened 286 times in the First Testament. 150 of those are in Leviticus, so this is prime territory. And of those 150, 107 of them are in these 5 chapters. That's 37%. For all of you who are math people, David, check my numbers. To say it succinctly, we are at the source of the river of what unclean means. So what does this word mean in Leviticus 11 through 15? It's most often an adjective that describes animals, people, and things that were not to come into contact with things that were considered holy. However, this is not because the things were gross, disgusting, or immoral. The fact is that most scholars really have no idea why these things shouldn't have been in contact with the holy, but here they are. There is one thing we can be sure of, though. It is not because they are immoral and evil or disgusting and dirty. Eating pigs is never equated with evil, and like it or not, it is never equated with disease. That's a popular interpretation. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. What we need to be clear on, I think, is this. Unclean does not mean sinful. That's what I want you to hear. It simply means that a person is prohibited from approaching the holy things for his or her own protection. Okay? It has the person in mind. So, we have an easier task, I think, with the word clean, so I'll keep it short and sweet. It suffers from the same affliction as unclean insofar as it finds a majority of its occurrences right here in chapters 11 through 15 of Leviticus. A person who is clean is not necessarily someone who is upstanding or moral. Rather, clean refers to a person that has not been made unclean by the variety of things that are listed, or someone who has gone through the cleansing rituals once they have recovered from their uncleanness. So, as we examine these terms that are so foundational to this part of Leviticus, here's what I want you to get. The status of clean and unclean has nothing to do with the moral and immorality, or the morality or the immorality, and everything to do with the access a person has to the tabernacle in order to worship and offer sacrifices. So it all has to do with their access to worship. Okay? But why? Why are there such limitations on those who can approach the tabernacle? Let's address each of the areas of uncleanness and attempt to discover the intentions behind these taboos. Yes, we're going to go chapter by chapter. And as we do this, we cannot and should not divorce these laws and rituals from their stated purpose, which we actually find in chapter 11, verse 44. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves unclean. So, these laws are intended to facilitate God's people maintaining their status as a people dedicated, holy to the service of God in the world. Okay, with all that said, here's a little disclaimer. As I go through each of these chapters and tell you what I think the intention is behind these laws, let it be known that there are as many ideas behind the dietary laws as there are people that have them. Okay, so I hope that I'm faithful to the intention of the text, but I'm also one of many voices. So don't just assume that I'm right about everything. If you want to disagree, you can read the commentaries with me, and we'll discuss it later. All right, so as we go through, what I want you to remember is our primary question. How do these sacred procedures facilitate the faithful development of the Israelites as a holy people? That's our focused question. So, the eating habits, chapter 11. The eating habits of Israel were addressed in 5 major areas. Now, I'm going to give you a very good way to summarize this long chapter, so if you don't ever want to read it again, pay attention. There are 5 major areas: land creatures, sea creatures, flying creatures, winged insects, and swarming or creeping things. Okay, those are the 5. And here's the general rundown. Edible land creatures should have cloven hooves and chew the cud. That means they eat grass, regurgitate it, eat it again. Okay, ruminating animals, cows, and so on. Edible sea creatures should have fins and scales. If they don't, no good. And edible flying creatures should be vegetarians. Okay? Edible winged insects should have 4 legs, no more, and 2 of them should be jointed so they can hop. That's just what it says. Okay? And in the 5th category, do not eat swarming things. Nothing swarming is good. Okay? So that's the summary of the chapter. You have now read 53 verses, however many verses that chapter is. While there are many examples given regarding what animals are and are not acceptable, it's not really meant to be comprehensive, and you'll get that if you read it. Rather, the examples are a demonstration of how to discern what animals are eligible for consumption. It would be convenient if we could say that they were limited to animals that were used in pagan worship. Don't eat any animals in pagan worship. But crabs and lobsters were not used in worship, and those are unclean, so that doesn't work. On the other hand, it would be convenient if we could say, oh, it's limited to animals that the Israelites were allowed to sacrifice, but they never bring fish into the tabernacle, so that doesn't work either. So then, the question we have to ask: how do these dietary restrictions facilitate the faithful development of the Israelites as a holy people? The most likely answer for me is limitation, discernment, and responsibility. With these regulations, the Israelites were called to carefully discern what animals they could and could not consume. So chapter 11 is a way of making that discernment have ritual consequences and importance. Perhaps the animals that were to be considered consumable shared some commonality that we're not able to distinguish. But what is important is that the people of God are marked by careful and thoughtful consumption, which is of special importance when the primary place that you would slaughter animals for meat, food, was at the tabernacle during worship. Therefore, your eating habits had a lot to say about your worshiping habits, and therefore your holiness. So, let's move on to chapter 12, a nice short chapter on childbearing. Chapter 12 is a short, simple regulation regarding women who have recently given birth. The regulation states that they are to remain unclean for 33 days if they have a male child, 66 days if they have a female child. To reiterate, this is not because having children is sinful. This uncleanness is not a result of sin, or that having a female child is more sinful than having a male child. More than likely, this was to prevent the association of fertility with the worship of God in the tabernacle. Unlike the fertility cults that were focused on temple prostitution, childbirth, and child sacrifice to appeal to their gods, the God of Israel would have nothing to do with this. So, how does this sacred procedure of uncleanness facilitate the faithful development of the Israelites as a holy people? It helps them to understand that while they have a place of worship just like their neighbors do, it does not function in the same way. Such things are not to be worshipped. They are an ordinary part of life and nothing more. Then we move on to the fun chapters. Chapters 13 and 14 deal with skin diseases, mold, and rot in a house. Now, these chapters present a particular challenge because they do talk a bit about sin. And here's why. In this society, skin diseases, mold, rot were often associated with divine curses because they physically displayed death and decay. Having a disease that displayed such a nearness of death so clearly was seen as a way to discern that someone had transgressed some divine law within their culture. So in this case, does uncleanness equal sin? as Paul would say, by no means, or meganoita if you want to say it in Greek. It's fun to say it that way, meganoita. Rather, it is likely that the Israelites would have immediately assumed that such a person was in fact sinful. So, this ritual is instituted to combat such an association and call for inspection by priests that can diagnose and evaluate the health of the person in question. As a part of this discernment, the person afflicted was deemed unclean in case the disease was in fact a result of sin or transgression. And after a person was cleared from their disease, there was a complex ritual that invited them back into the community and back into the tabernacle. So how does this ritual facilitate faithful development of the Israelites as a holy people? It takes a common perception among the people and forces them to think outside of their cultural paradigms. And while the ritual of restoration includes a sin offering, the ritual refuses to say that these afflictions were in fact caused by God because of sin. So, in a society that would have immediately ostracized such people, the Israelites were called to patiently wait for the restoration of their brothers and sisters that were temporarily deemed unclean. We'll get to the cleansing rituals in a second. I want to skip forward to chapter 15, everyone's favorite chapter on genital discharges. This is going to be a fun Sunday in church. Similar to the skin diseases, these diseases were also sometimes equated with sin in the culture. Issues of fertility and unnatural discharge were associated with a divine curse because, once again, they represent death, right? These are the organs with which you reproduce. If they're not functioning correctly, then obviously it's because of sin. Therefore, just like the skin diseases, it was necessary to isolate such individuals until after their affliction dissipated as a way of confirming whether or not it was an issue of sin. In this section, it is also important to notice that normal discharges do not necessitate ritual sacrifice. In order to come back to the community, you just needed to wash your clothes and yourself and be unclean until evening, which was the beginning of the day. So, how do these sacred procedures facilitate faithful development? Similar to the issue of childbearing, the unclean status bestowed on those who are menstruating and men who have had an emission refuses to let sexual acts be permitted in the tabernacle, one of the primary ways that the gods of the surrounding areas were worshipped. The Israelites were to demonstrate their faithfulness to God by not allowing the things that their neighbors would associate with worship into the tabernacle. So finally, we come to the cleansing ritual, which I hope is a favorite of yours. I know it's a favorite of mine. And I want to get into this in a little more detail, so I'm actually going to read this passage to you. It's found in Leviticus 14, verses 1 through 9. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing." It'll sound a lot like the little ritual I described on my own up front. "He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then, if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over living water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the living water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go into the open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all of his hair, and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside it at his tent for 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all the hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. He shall shave off all his hair, and then he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean." Rituals just like these were quite prevalent in the surrounding cultures. This one had a very important difference, though. In the surrounding cultures, such as Hittites and even the Egyptians, just where the Israelites have come from, these rituals were conducted by magicians in order to drive out the demonic power that was causing the disease. God takes this ritual that was most likely embedded in the practice of the people of Israel and takes away its demonic and magical association with one phrase. In the middle of verse 3 going through verse 4, it says, "The priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then if the case of skin disease is healed in the person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed," and then it gives the ritual. Do you hear the difference? The priest has no role to play in the healing of the disease or in its prevention at all. All he can do is perform the ritual of evaluation and see if the person has been healed. In this way, cleansing rituals become metaphorical ways of expressing how a person has moved from the jaws of death into the hands of the living God. This is ultimately the issue of things that are clean and unclean. Things that are clean are filled with life and vitality. Things that are unclean have blood flowing from their bodies, have their skin wasting away from their bodies, and have life-giving organs that are not functioning appropriately. Such signs of death and destruction are not to be associated with the tabernacle and the worship of God. But when someone recovers from such signs of death, the ritual reminds them of how life can spring from death. So a bird is killed and its blood, its life, is drained into living water, and a live bird with parts of living trees and a piece of woven yarn are dipped into these two life-giving substances. And after sprinkling the person, the live bird, is released to symbolize the person's freedom from the otherwise deadly situation. There is no magic involved in this. And so how is this supposed to cultivate faithfulness among the Israelites? It allows them to move away from the idea that powerful magic and demonic possession were effective for cleansing skin diseases and other forces of death that helped them think about cleansing rituals as a symbolic act that represented their disease and death being carried away and life and vitality returning to them, which in turn calls them back to the tabernacle so that they can worship the living God. So, what happened to these sacred procedures that were supposed to forge a faithful and holy people? It doesn't take a lot of reading in the Gospels before it becomes clear that being unclean, use Claudia's, right, always see this when I say unclean. Clear that being unclean to the Pharisees of Jesus' day was equivalent to being sinful. This is likely due to the fact that it was a favorite metaphor of the prophets in the First Testament to use the word unclean to speak of sin, especially Ezekiel. Over time, this metaphor was interpreted literally by the Jews, and in the centuries surrounding Jesus' birth, it was read back into Leviticus. And so we should not be surprised that since Jesus' primary task is to announce the kingdom of God and the reconciliation of humanity into that kingdom, that he must in some way help his fellow Jewish leaders to rethink this misconception. And so, if you've read your passages in the daily worship guide this week, you're aware that the Gospel of Mark shows Jesus addressing almost every kind of uncleanness mentioned and attempts to reorient the Pharisees toward a more likely interpretation of Leviticus through not just his words, but also his actions. For instance, in the passage that Claudia read this morning from Mark chapter 5, Jesus walks into a Gentile country. Anyone living outside of the camp of Israel, unclean. To a graveyard, dead bodies, unclean. To a man who has an evil spirit, unclean. Who is cutting himself, blood is unclean. And is surrounded by a herd of pigs, unclean. In the best case scenario, Jesus should be unclean until evening. And then after he has washed himself and his clothes, he can be welcomed back into the community. But what does he do instead? He marches right back into Galilee, an Israelite town, clean, as though there is nothing wrong with him. What's worse, a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years, genital discharge equals unclean, touches him. But instead of communicating her uncleanness to Jesus, her uncleanness is driven out from her. Coming fresh out of Leviticus, this should astound us. Jesus apparently has no care with regard to the uncleanness of the people around him, and he is the very presence of God and the Spirit in the flesh, if we believe the Gospels. So what's going on here? Well, there's no direct answer given. If we assume that Jesus is God in the flesh, all we can do is assume that the way the Pharisees understood uncleanness, namely as sin, perhaps was not correct. It's not until chapter 7 that we're given a verbal interpretation, which I am thankful for. As the Pharisees questioned Jesus regarding a Pharisaical rule, commanding that hands were to be washed before a meal in order to avoid being made unclean, Jesus confronts them about their dedication to these rituals and interpretations, which aren't part of Torah itself, but a part of the interpretations of their fathers. After a quick and witty condemnation, and it is quick and witty, Jesus quickly turns the conversation into an issue of intentions. Jesus responds to all the people around him. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can make that person unclean. But the things that come out of a person are what makes that person unclean. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot make that person unclean, since it enters not into the person's heart, but into his stomach and is expelled? So what exactly is Jesus getting at? It seems that he's encountering a community that has distorted the rules and regulations of Leviticus to serve a different set of intentions. These sacred procedures were supposed to cultivate a discerning people that were focused on the restoration of their brothers and sisters who suffered from afflictions that normally led to death, with the purpose that all would be eligible to worship in the tabernacle, or in this case, the temple. Instead, they had moved in the opposite direction of the intention of these sacred procedures. They turned these things into a source of condemnation rather than a means of education and reorientation. So Jesus goes for the gut and forces the religious leaders to come to grips with their inner uncleanness, their actual sinfulness. You see, if a sin is a matter of Levitical uncleanness, then the Pharisees were good to go. We might even be good to go. Avoid contact with the unclean, and we have no sin. Easy. Keep sin as far away as possible, and in their case, perhaps God would save them from the Romans. Simple plan. Jesus unearths the flaw. The uncleanness they were avoiding did not keep them from their own misaligned intentions, their misunderstanding of what God intended. In other words, their attempt to avoid sin by avoiding unclean things and ostracizing unclean people led them to actual sin rather than the metaphor that uncleanness is, which in turn demonstrates their lack of understanding regarding these sacred procedures. We have sacred procedures. At Discovery, we have things that we do every week. In the midst of these habits, we have households that we manage. We have food we eat together. We meet and we read scripture in various settings. We pray in various settings. We worship each week right here. And there's an order to our worship. While there are probably some anomalies here and there, we have a sacred procedure for our life together. But what is the intention behind that procedure? Is there an intention? Do you find yourself wondering, I don't know what the point of all this is? I'll have to say, over the last year, a little over a year since I've been here, the board has met every other week, and I've listened as they've engaged and discussed the core values of our church and attempted to describe the kind of culture we want here at Discovery. And we've discussed how our core values and our cultural values at Discovery are being manifested and embraced through our weekly life together, our sacred procedures. And let me make it clear to you, there is absolutely an intention to everything that Discovery does. There's an intention to every song that is chosen, every scripture that is read, every word that is spoken from the pulpit. But our sacred procedures can only communicate so much of the intention. It takes an active participant to look behind the ritual to learn the meaning. So, I urge you not just to go through the motions, not to just dismiss the motions as if they don't make sense because they're not important. I urge you all to ask, why? I urge you all to discover the meaning behind our daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly procedures. because we have important values that we are trying to communicate in them. And maybe if we all pursue the meaning behind them, we will all have a more vital role in developing them. If we do this, perhaps we'll be more active in communicating these values and intentions in our practices and to our children as well. And in this way, I hope we might avoid the pitfall of the Pharisees, who simply communicated rituals rather than teaching intentions. May our sacred procedures never become a way to say that we have no sin, but rather a way to facilitate the confession of sin and the genuine seeking of God's intentions for our community. And may God help us in that endeavor as we go forward. On the back of your notes, I just asked one question. What rituals have lost meaning for you, or something like that? I don't have it right in front of me. But I want you throughout this week to reflect on that question. What things do you do week after week, day after day, that you finish and then find yourself saying, why did I even do this? Write those things down and ask someone about it. Ask why they do it. Help to get some perspective as you participate in what we would call sacred things in our lives.